Hi, it's a great pleasure to have Laura Piddock today as my guest for the blog, and we're planning to talk about antibiotic resistance. I invited Laura because she's a microbiologist. She's specializing in antibiotics and antibiotic resistance in bacteria. She's Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham and also Scientific Director with the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership. Thank you so much, Laura, for taking time to talk with me today. I thought that we'd start with a very simple question about what are antibiotics and why do we need them?
So antibiotics are substances that either stop bacteria growing or kill them.
And you know, kind of going from there, what kind of diseases do we need to use antibiotics in? What is their use? When should we use them?
So antibiotics is the common term for antibacterial drugs, although historically antibiotic, the word, means antibiosis, against life. But nowadays, we all think about antibiotics as being antibacterial, which means they only work against bacteria. So they don't work against common coughs and colds, such as, tickly throats, sneezes. They really don't work against COVID either. And we need to make sure that we only use antibiotics when they are needed. So there are certain infections where they are absolutely essential. So they were first developed in the 1930s to treat pneumonia. And pneumonia today is still a fatal infection if it's not treated with antibiotics. And this is commonly caused by a bacterium called Streptococcus pneumoniae. Other infections are bloodstream infections, very, very serious, again, life-threatening. You absolutely have to have an antibiotic. The confusion for people comes for things like sore throats or earaches. So most sore throats and earaches are caused by viruses and no antibiotic is needed. So people shouldn't go to their doctor or other healthcare professional or even to a pharmacy and buy an antibiotic because they think their sore throat or earache will be made better. What they need is to see a healthcare professional if that sore throat and earache does not get better after a few days. Often people will get an antibiotic and think they start to feel better within a day of taking it. Therefore, the antibiotic has made them better. And the answer is no, it hasn't. It's almost certainly a coincidence. So we have to keep these drugs for the really serious things that they're needed for. Sometimes something is serious, such as a skin infection, which just doesn't clear up with the topical creams. And so sometimes people will need antibiotic tablets for that as well, because these infections can go into the skin and into the bloodstream. But most infections need to be diagnosed by a proper healthcare professional, and antibiotics should always be on prescription, never purchased by one diagnosing oneself by doing an internet search.
And I guess the danger here is of misuse of antibiotics. And I guess, is there, other than the personal harm that the person will do by misusing antibiotics, what is the general harm that this can cause to society?
Well, I think harm is in two ways. First of all, antibiotics are very powerful drugs, and many of the ones that we use don't just target the bacterial cause of the infection, but they could also target and stop bacteria growing or even kill them if they're on our skin or in our gut. And these are what some people call our good bacteria or our microbiome. Absolutely essential for us to be healthy. So if we take antibiotics, we can affect ourselves and have unintended consequences. Indeed, some antibiotics lead people to get diarrhea, for instance. And this is just an unnecessary consequence of taking a drug that you may not need. Obviously, if you need it and you get that consequence, then the doctor or the prescriber will seek alternatives. For wider society, the problem with widespread use of antibiotics is that bacteria can become resistant to them. And this is evolution. So the more we expose a bacterium to a drug, the more likely the emergence of a resistant strain. And those resistant strains have an advantage in the presence of an antibiotic. They will still be able to grow and multiply, whereas the drug-sensitive strains will be killed.
Actually, I'm going to put a link to this. There is, I probably saw it, this experiment that was done at Harvard with this big bacterial
across
plate.
the mega plate.
Yeah, so I'll put the mega plate in the background for people to actually see how antibiotic resistance can become, how bacteria can become resistant in a very visual way. I thought that was such a mind-blowing experiment.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive.
Sorry for interrupting you. It just came to
No,
mind.
it is a very elegant way of showing it, but that only shows one type of emergence of resistance. So what that is showing is the emergence of resistance, what we call de novo in a bacterium. But bacteria also have sex, and they share their genetic material, and sometimes that is a drug resistance gene. So drug resistance can develop in bacteria, but they can also share it between themselves, totally different way of becoming drug resistant. But then we also share our bacteria. So the more we use antibiotics, the more we encourage bacteria to become drug resistant or to share their drug resistant genes. And then we share bacteria, and just like COVID, these resistant bacteria go very quickly throughout the world. And for some infections by some bacterial species, there's very few drugs left. And in some countries, we definitely have patients who have completely resistant infections. They are untreatable. Now, the World Health Organization, WHO, has got a list of these what they call priority pathogens, for which there is a critical or high priority for new treatments. And it's really important people recognize that if this is being talked about in high political levels, high health levels, so this is on the G7 and G20 discussions, all sorts of different groups around the world, policymakers, as well as healthcare professionals, are so concerned about this now that we don't have enough new drugs coming through the pipeline or alternative treatments, and there's lots of different innovative ways we could start tackling bacterial infections. The bottom line is we as patients, as people, need to stop using antibiotics unless they are needed.
Yeah. I guess without becoming fatalists or having a negative way of thinking, but this can get out of hand, right? I mean, we've just been through a pandemic, and is antibiotic resistance, does it have that, even if it's 1% chance to become a wild world problem that could impair our society?
We've seen drug resistance travel from west to east, from east to west, and north to south, and vice versa. People travel. our animals travel, our foods travel, and bacteria travel with us, and those things.
And I guess, is there a risk more for people that are in hospitals? Are there, hospitals hotspots of bacterial resistance?
So many of the drug resistances start out in community, out in you and I, we're walking around, and often we might have drug resistant bacteria on our skin or in our gut. Why are hospitals an issue? Well, that's where there's vulnerable people. So they're going to be very susceptible to picking up an infection, and they could pick up a drug-resistant bacterial infection. So that is the issue for hospitals. And then, of course, it can be transferred around within wards or between other hospital areas. And this is what we call infection prevention and control. There's a lot of work being done, for instance, washing your hands, which has become so commonplace in the last 2 years due to COVID. That's something that is really important at reducing transfer of drug-resistant bacteria. We should continue washing our hands, not just because of COVID, but to minimize any other infection, whether it be bacterial, viral, or any other microbe. It's a real first port is to prevent infection. The other thing, of course, is vaccination. There's quite a lot of vaccines available to bacterial infections. And I'm a huge supporter of getting those vaccines, particularly in children and the elderly and other vulnerable groups, because preventing infection is far, far easier than treating it.
And this is a real problem now. I mean, people die of septicemia, right? That presumably part of it is due to a bacterial infection,
Yes.
right? And that's still at the top of, I used to be, I should have looked before, but it used to be a couple of years was the biggest killer. I don't know if that's still the case.
Yes, sepsis is still a major killer worldwide. About 80% of sepsis cases are caused by a bacterium, so they're of bacterial origin. So antibiotics are always given to patients with sepsis, particularly on admission to hospital if they're emergency admissions. Sepsis is a huge issue throughout the world. Interestingly, it's a huge issue for babies. Neonatal sepsis is something that is really under-recognized over the last 10, 20 years. We all think about adults going to hospital, and we know about the symptoms of sepsis in many countries. There's been a lot of awareness campaigns, but babies get it too, particularly newborn babies. So it's very important that we recognize that we don't just need to treat adults, we have to have drugs for children and babies. And it may surprise you to know that many of the drugs that we can use in adults are not available for children or babies. So the crisis, in a way, the biggest burden is in babies and children.
And that's because babies are born without a strong immune system, and that's why this becomes such a big problem.
Yes, and particularly they don't get good immunity from their mothers, or they're exposed very early on in life to a bacterial strain, particularly if it's drug resistant, huge problems. And in fact, there's been some very good reports in the last couple of years showing that the greatest burden of drug resistant infections in terms of illness and in death is amongst babies.
Yeah, and then I guess the other question is about how we're disposing of these drugs, right? Because I imagine they will have an impact not only on humans, but on the broad environment. And is that an issue?
Yes.
And how should we handle this?
Yeah, so for the everyday person, if we're given antibiotics and we really need those antibiotics, and I say given, that means prescription, we're taking them because we need them, should always take the course as recommended by that healthcare professional. Don't stop taking them just because you feel better. Bacteria can hide, and as soon as you stop taking them, they'll quite happily grow back again. So you must take them for the course, whatever that course is, and it does depend on the drug and the infection. But if for any reason you stop taking antibiotics, you're at home, not in hospital, don't dispose of them in the waste bin or throw them down the toilet or down the sink, because they're just going to go into our waterways. Our waterways have bacteria, and so drug-resistant bacteria will emerge there. And it may surprise you to know that some drug resistances that now cause problems in human health emerge from bacteria that are normally found in rivers. So this is a big problem, wastewater management. Big companies that manufacture antibiotics, they're now tasked with making sure they don't discharge any into waterways.
So
this very reason.
What's the best way of getting rid of them if you have them in your house, if you're an everyday?
So you should take it to your pharmacist and ask them to dispose of it safely for you.
And one of my last questions is, I remember when I was a child, there were these pharmacies that they were more like they're making their drugs in the pharmacy, and then when I would take an antibiotic, they would use this antibiotic resistance. They will take a swab, grow the bacteria on a main antibiotic plate, and say, okay, this is the bacteria that will work best for you. And I see that this is kind of not there anymore. And is there a reason for that, or is there a reason to go back to that? Even in UK, for example, if I get antibiotic, nobody will give, look to see what kind of bacteria. Is just an assumption. So is that a good practice? Should we go back to that?
So if you're going to see your general practitioner, your local doctor or other healthcare professional, most of the things that people go to the doctors with are not caused by bacteria, most. So what that healthcare professional do is use their expertise and their experience of knowing the symptoms and what the most likely cause is. So they're unlikely to send a sample off for the clinical microbiology tests you've just described. For instance, with people who get recurrent bladder infections, urinary tract infections, if they go back more than once, then usually a sample is taken and sent to the laboratory. But here's the problem, as you've just said, it takes time. By the time the sample gets to the lab, you then have 24 hours to grow it, another 24 hours to determine what drugs work. The patient's been given an antibiotic 2 or 3 days previously when they saw the doctor.
Yes.
So those results will arrive usually when the patient is well into treatment, and usually the patient is getting better. Now, for people who have repeated infections, maybe of their bladder, then those results are very, very important. But for most of us, those tests just aren't needed. Now, the difference is in hospital patients, then those tests are usually done, because they're often more ill than patients who walk into a doctor's surgery.
Yeah. So then I guess my last question is, what can we do? I mean, not all of us get antibiotics all the time. So what can the general population do? Family, friends, should they kind of hold hands and say, look, maybe you shouldn't take that? So is this a public responsibility? I guess it is a question, or is an individual responsibility?
I think it's everybody's responsibility. We need to protect these drugs because they do save lives. They are miracle drugs. They've saved far more lives than we've seen with any other therapeutic class of drugs. We take them for granted. So what we have to do is really only ask for antibiotics if we really need them. And we need to recognize that coughs and colds very rarely need them, and stop sharing our microbes. So if I've got a cough or a cold, I stay away from the people in my home. I say, don't come near me, I could give you this. And I do think that COVID has really helped people become much more aware of how easy it is to give each other an infection. So all the things we do to prevent getting COVID, we should do to prevent getting bacterial infections. And that would be a major advance. So keep washing hands, keep staying away from people when you're ill. Don't go to work or school if you've got a cough or a cold or you're sneezing, or if you have diarrhea or you're being sick, which are typically of infectious causes. Doesn't matter what's causing them, just stay away from other people and don't share your microbes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Laura. It was a pleasure to talking with you, and really thank you for your efforts on doing this very important work for us. And I'm looking forward to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much for asking me to talk today.